Well, I hope you enjoyed your study of some of the Anglo-Saxon riddles in the Exeter book. Certainly, it demonstrates that despite the fact this was a warrior culture and looks very barbaric, at least from the artifacts that we've recovered in the time period, there really was some sophistication and cleverness that existed with this people. For today's lesson, we're going to take a look at the first of three poems that we will read from the Exeter book as well. These are referred to, and I cluster them together as exile poetry, and we'll discuss and define exile in the notes that you'll take on the separate assignment I have posted. Our objective is using guided notes, you will successfully define exile and elegy as they relate to Anglo-Saxon poetry, and specifically the Seafarer to express the hardship and uncertainty of Anglo-Saxon life. The big question that much of our study will reveal is that what is the relationship between literature and place? That the poetry that comes from this time period is very much shaped by the island and the circumstances of that location geographically, on the culture and on the things that we have in the poetry that was written or recorded down by the monks of the Catholic Church. If you can recall back, they are the ones that wrote it down, but they were the stories of the people that were around them. So the three poems we are going to take a look at are The Seafarer, The Wanderer, and The Wife's Lament. They are all three included in the textbook, and I will be providing PDF copies of each of these. The Exeter book we talked about a little bit last week, or earlier in this week, I'm sorry, where, it's pretty rare to have a book of sorts during this time period, but it's thought that sometime during the reign of Alfred the Great, and he was the king that unified all the Anglo-Saxon tribes to fight against the common enemy of the Vikings in the 800s. It was probably compiled by monks then, features the riddles, and features these three poems. This was one of the riddles that you took a look at in your work on Wednesday. It's one of my favorites, and it was a reference to a boat or a ship. So I don't know if you remember that one. Lots of clues kind of were there. It's a machine. It's made for motion, right? It would shriek when it hits the sand, so you would imagine the sound at the bottom of the boat coming up against the shore. The 1 foot is its rudder. It doesn't have arms or hands, but the ribs of the boat would be like the bottom structure of it. Its mouth in the middle, because if this was your boat, takes things that way. So hopefully you found that interesting. The poems that we're going to talk about all have a common theme of exile, and they are known as elegies or elegiac poems. All right, an elegy, and there's a place for you to define this on your notes, is a reflective poem that laments the loss of someone or something. The poems deal with loss when it comes to the social bonds that knit together Anglo-Saxon tribes and communities. There were three major social bonds that defined your role in that community. You had your bond with your king, or they call it a lord, but not like a capital L, like Christian God Lord. And this is known as the comitatus relationship. And there was a mutual loyalty, kind of a quid pro quo that happened between warriors and the person that their king, their tribe leader. The warriors would vow their loyalty and that they would die for that king. And in return, that king would give them gifts of gold and take care of them and feast with them in the mead halls. So it was a mutually beneficial relationship between the two. The leader would have protection. Of course, there was protection in numbers for the rest of the community. And at the same time, this was a way to be rewarded from someone who had some kind of social prominence and wealth, perhaps. The second major social bond is your extended family group. Another word for this is your kin. Kinship is your connection to others. It's, doesn't have to be blood, but in this case it is. Your tribe, your family. And it doesn't just mean your immediate family, but lots of cousins and extended family too. And if you think of your last name as kind of evidence of your tribe, like I'm a member of the Gerst tribe because when my husband married me, I guess arguably you could say I sort of became his property, and that's why I took on their last name, even though obviously contemporary ways of approaching that are different. There's just some remnants of the past in some of our practices. And the third major social bond is marriage. And the last poem that we read, The Wife's Lament, will deal with that bond and when it gets broken. When those bonds get broken or there's separation from community, we are going to refer to that as exile. Okay. And you're going to see through our study of Anglo-Saxon poetry that exile is thought to be one of the worst things that could happen to you, because survival was so difficult at this time. This is a time when you did not have stability. There wasn't a steady power. It was a vicious world. That's why you benefited from being in a community. You could work together with other people to farm so that you'd have food security. You would rely on the people in your community and your warriors to protect you from other tribes nearby that might invade and plunder your community's resources. The three types of exile, we're going to talk about different types of exile in these poems. And the first is what we're going to call exile by choice. So we're going to have actually the speaker of our first poem in The Seafarer. You're going to learn that he actually chooses a life of separation because he loves it, even though he misses being with people. Okay. And I'll try to explain how exactly that can make sense. The second type of exile is exile by force, and this is when a circumstance forces you to be separate from the community you were once part of. So in this case, it might be because your king or your warrior leader dies, or everybody in your tribe dies if they've been attacked by another neighbor group, and you are left with no choice but to go in search of another place you belong. Or in the case of the wife's lament, she is cut off from her husband and sent to live in a cave based on some rumors that spread while he was away at sea. All of these deal with being at sea because it was just such a primary element of their culture. The last type of exile we'll talk about, we actually won't touch upon until we read the excerpts from the epic poem Beowulf, and that's exile by God. You're going to find that the antagonist in that narrative, Grendel, he is a large monster that starts attacking men in King Hrothgar's mead hall. And Grendel is a descendant from Cain, who is the son of Adam and Eve, who killed his brother, according to the book of Genesis. And so because of that, because he's one of his descendants, he is cursed by God and then has spiritual separation or exile. All right, The Seafarer, you're going to see this on page 21 in the textbook PDF that I provided to you. At this point, what I'm going to do is end this video and make a separate video of me just reading the text aloud. You're going to find a place to answer 7 questions when it comes to this particular poem. A kind of a quick overview of it is that there's this lonely seafarer, a guy out at sea, like a guy on a boat. He's drifting in icy waters. You can imagine the temperature based on where England is located. He's far from companionship and he's drowning in desolation, but he starts thinking about things that give him hope. And we'll talk about in class next week. He finds comfort that, nobody is really ever at home when they're on earth because our true home is in heaven. But what's kind of interesting about that is the Anglo-Saxons did not believe in a Christian heaven. And so it's evidence of where those monks who wrote down the stories of the people added some stuff into it. The questions that I have for you to help you analyze the poem are listed 1 through 5. We're going to be talking about alliteration and kenning, which were 2 terms we defined in our lesson from riddles. So you might need to refer back to what exactly a kenning was and what exactly alliteration is, although most of us are pretty good with that. And 6 and 7 relate specifically to the content of The Seafarer. All right, I'm going to stop for now, and I'm going to make another video where I read the poem aloud so you can hear it.